Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. I think I start a lot of my videos these days by apologizing for not being around Booktube enough. I'll start with a very brief personal update, and then near the end, I'll tell you a little about my immediately upcoming plans, which may make you see more of me than you might want. The personal part. First, if you're not interested in this part, please feel free to skip ahead. I'll leave timestamps to make that easier. So I'm healing well post-rotator cuff surgery, getting a lot of movement back in my shoulder and some strength in my arm too. Honestly, it takes a lot of time and energy to do the physical work of rehab. Some of that energy is just emotional. There are times after I've used shoulder muscles that I haven't used in months and months when just the smallest little exercises cause a lot of pain. And while I can handle the physical pain, I'll admit that sometimes that discomfort makes me panic that I've ruined the surgical repair. And then, a day or two later, I'm not only back to normal, but actually stronger. That process seems to happen whenever I get a new kind of exercise that works a previously unworked area. So now I'm beginning to expect at those times a day or two of increased pain, and I no longer panic in the way I did earlier. The shoulder injury has limited my reading abilities too, and reading choices as well. As I heal, I'm sleeping a lot more, which I thought would not really still be true at this point, but so be it. Mostly, it's hard to read physical books and almost impossible to write in my books, which is such my normal way of reading nonfiction that I feel a little unmoored without doing it. Writing in my books seems to cement a book's ideas in my head and helps me think about them. And I'm really missing it. Even highlighting on my e-reader is quite awkward. But there's also another personal issue. I'm in the midst of another medical workup that has me a little stressed emotionally and a little stressed physically, since I'm sometimes called to lie on my back for procedures for this new issue, and lying directly on my back is quite uncomfortable for my shoulder, etc. This is more detailed than you need, but suffice it to say that I found myself tremendously distracted over the last few months, and Booktube and even reading have really not been huge priorities. But there have been some great bookish and book-adjacent moments. First, let me start with a discussion of a few reading-adjacent activities that I've enjoyed recently. First, I attended 2 online events, both celebrating Emily Dickinson's birthday. The first event was held at the Folger Shakespeare Library in D.C. I love seeing plays and other events at the Folger, but this time I chose to watch the live stream of the library celebration. The evening's discussion was, well, not a comparison, but a discussion about some of the potential parallels between Dickinson and Jane Austen, authors the main host called 2 kick-ass women writers, even though neither woman has been seen that way traditionally. That host, the scholar who led a discussion with 2 other folks and also introduced actors who recited some of Dickinson's poetry and Austen's prose, is actually a friend and neighbor. That is the Dickinson scholar Martha Nell Smith, who wrote the work starting decades ago, I guess, that really brought forward details about Emily's close relationship with her sister-in-law. Martha's scholarship, as well as the primary material that she's highlighted, has contributed to quite a changed vision of Dickinson. Instead of seeing her as a timid recluse, she's now seen as far more complex. Certainly, if you read Dickinson's complete letters, you'll see that her emotional life was not the tame, withdrawn stereotype that many of us had assumed or were raised to believe. The celebration's general staged conversation was lovely, but I especially enjoyed the question and answer period at the end. The first question was, why are Austen and Dickinson cultural icons, but Willa Cather is not? That's quite an interesting question, of course, but it was also really funny, and many people in the audience broke out in laughter. Those of us laughing knew that Martha Nell Smith is married to Marilee Lindemann, a prominent scholar of Willa Cather. A couple of years ago, for my celebration of what I've always called Hannah's BOOKUKKAH, when I try to make videos for all 8 nights of Hanukkah, I spent the whole period reading and thinking about Willa Cather, and I believe I shared another funny story about the two scholars and their work. I'll link to it if I did. And more about plans for this year's Hannah's BOOKUKKAH near the end of the video. Well, the next night I attended, again virtually, another birthday party, this time held by the Emily Dickinson Museum, located in Dickinson's hometown of Amherst, Massachusetts. Part of this night's celebration was to share some of the special things the museum had done during the year, and included a discussion of what sounds like a fascinating art installation. I won't go into details right now, but one of the artists called our attention to the wallpaper in Emily Dickinson's bedroom, which was also her study and the place where she did much of her writing. Well, let me show you what it looked like. Many of us might be a little startled by the bold floral print that surrounded someone we typically thought of as quite delicate. But boldness wasn't what the artist was pointing out. She was thinking of not the flowers, but the background. The artist was noticing that when Emily was in her room, she was absolutely surrounded by dashes wherever she looked. If you're unfamiliar with Dickinson's poetry, let me show you one very typical example. Her preferred punctuation mark appears to have been the dash. Okay, one more online event I attended this week, an art-related meditation presented by the Phillips collection in Washington, D.C. I was a little worried this would be cheesy, but it was not. Many of you may know that D.C. is home to a lot of museums, many of them federally funded and therefore free for visitors, like the 2 huge buildings of the National Gallery of Art, the National Portrait Gallery, and various Smithsonian museums, etc. During the recent government shutdown, these museums were shuttered, but D.C. also has several non-government-owned museums. The 2 I love most are the Phillips Collection and the National Museum of Women in the Arts. Typically, I bought annual memberships to them, going on alternate years. If you're a member of one of the museums at a certain level, which is roughly equal to joining both museums at the starter level, you can visit not only both of these museums, but a large number of other museums around the U.S. for free. Anyway, this year is a Phillips year for me, so I spent some time exploring their website more carefully than usual. And I stumbled across the fact that once a month they host lunchtime events online that start with a brief discussion by one of the curators of a few pieces of work, usually from the collection, followed by a brief period of meditation, led by various meditation leaders in the area, related in some minor way to the art we've been looking at. If we see paintings with amazing landscapes from the southwest of the U.S., or pieces that show stormy skies of winter, these images might appear in whatever the meditation teachers say. Well, this time, we looked at the work of one of my very favorite artists, whose pieces hang in a few D.C. museums. Calder, with his amazing and sometimes enormous mobiles and stabiles. Maybe I'll talk more about him next September during the Art Readathon Framed here on BookTube. Anyway, during the latter part of the art discussion, we were talking about how some of Calder's mobiles make sound, make noise, sometimes with chimes, as they move. And during the meditation part afterwards, we did very mild yoga and stretching, while a musician composed music on the spot, responding to the movements that we did. Because my shoulder is still healing and my doctor has restricted my motions, I mostly focused on my breath. It was a lovely break during the middle of the day, and I think I'll be putting future sessions on my calendar. Well, let's head now to just a few of the books that I've read recently, which I think I will mention much more briefly since I went on longer than I expected about the earlier stuff. A couple of them were related to BookTube events. First, I read and loved Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American. It was the group read for Dr. November, and on this reading, I also watched the film, the one released in 2001 or so, which is quite faithful to the novel. I haven't read the book in years, maybe decades, and I had either forgotten or never quite thought about how the book plays with genre, borrowing elements of thriller and crime fiction and combining with some very literary techniques. Just to name the most obvious, one of the characters we spend a lot of time with sort of functions as a mirror of 1950s Vietnam, where the book is set. That character's relation to the other two main characters mirrors the way Vietnam is seen by the UK and the US. I know when I read The Quiet American years ago, when I was pretty young, I liked the book, but was a bit annoyed with Greene's portrayal of the main female character, something I saw as quite limited. And I assumed that was part of the school of male authors that Greene was part of, people I thought of as the mid-century misogynist. But on this reading, I see it a little differently. The character is really quite a cipher in many ways, without much of a voice. But that is really part of the point of the book. I'm so glad I picked it up this year. Another book I read that was readathon inspired was Agatha Christie's somewhat lesser known novel, The Secret Adversary, which I picked up for the Christie's Missing Project. First published in 1922 at the start of the so-called Roaring Twenties, the book introduces kind of a different set of detectives, not Miss Marple or Hercule Poirot, but Tommy and Tuppence. When I was a teen, I loved Miss Marple, but I absolutely adored this young pair of friends who set out partly to make some money and partly in search of adventure. And they only sort of accidentally fall into the work of being detectives. I wouldn't necessarily rave about these books as mysteries, but they have a wonderful sense of adventure, thrilling, and yet gentle in a way at the same time. Best of all, best for me, is the spunky young Tuppence we meet in The Secret Adversary. And then there's the romance. Two people who are longtime friends, who become colleagues, and then fall in love with each other in ways that feel modern and real. This first of the Tommy and Tuppence novels really emphasizes the setting, the 1920s spirit, the impact of the First World War in the UK, etc. I believe there are only 4 Tommy and Tuppence novels, plus a collection of short stories. Interestingly, the novels were spread out over a really long period of time. The first published in the 20s, as I said, and the second novel not until the 40s, and the third in the 60s, and the final novel about 5 years after that. And Christie doesn't just pick up the story where she left off. Instead, we see these two detectives and friends grow and change. And their worlds grow and change too over time. In the last novel, Tommy and Tuppence are anticipating more quiet years of retirement when they run across an old book with a coded message and are drawn to another adventure together. Well, after I reread The Secret Adversary and was looking up the title of the second book in the series, which turns out to be the collection of short stories, I was thrilled to see that there seems to be a new screen adaptation of Tommy and Tuppence in the pipeline. There have also been previous adaptations, none of which I've seen, so that gives me something to put in my queue. And then wildly, I watched a video by the amazing Gavin over at Genre Books talking about his plans to read some Christie early next year, and what was he thinking about but Tommy and Tuppence. So if everything works out for us, I plan to join him for reading the following novel in the series called NYRB, I believe. Another book I've been poking around in is Peter Fleming's Dark Academia, but I think I'll hold that for later after I finish the book. Similarly, after reading and enjoying E.B. White's Essays on Democracy, which I talked about recently, I picked up another volume of essays this week at the library, one I've read in before, but not read all of. And that's Jill Lepore's collection, The Deadline, which I'll probably talk about in a future video. Bigger news is what's coming up very shortly on this channel. Earlier, I mentioned my own little personal event of Hannah's BOOKUKKAH, where I do an abbreviated and Jewish version of Vlogmas and Book Advent and film videos on all 8 nights of the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. While I always allow myself to start reading in advance for whatever I'm going to talk about during BOOKUKKAH, I make a special point to plan and film the videos on the day I post them. To be honest, that is my typical style of booktubing anyway. But during BOOKUKKAH, that day making videos, rushing to finish editing and uploading before candle lighting has been part of my unconventional little way of celebrating the holiday. Last year, I made a random assortment of year-end type videos, and the year before, I did a deep dive into Willa Cather, as I mentioned a little earlier in the video. This year, I thought I would do something similar to the deep dive, this time focusing on EUDORA WELTY, one of my favorite authors from the 20th century U.S. South. My first video of BOOKUKKAH will be going up tomorrow night, assuming I can actually put all of this together this year. Also, this year, I have the very great pleasure of being joined in my celebration of BOOKUKKAH by another booktuber, the wonderful Marilyn Maya Mendoza at the eponymous channel. We'll be reading and discussing different things, but celebrating together. I'll leave a link to her channel below on the off chance that you don't already watch her lovely videos. Later in December, after BOOKUKKAH wraps up, and after my special holiday guest has to go home, I'm planning to join both the Ghosts of Christmas Readathon and the Dickens for Christmas project. My plan is to meet both of them by reading The Chimes by Charles Dickens. This is one I've not read before. Should be interesting. And I think I will be talking about it a bit on Christmas Day, maybe as part of a video I hope to be able to put together for the beautiful event Christmas Day on BookTube, dreamed up by Paul at the Accidental Bookseller, where people will post videos to keep company with anyone who is alone or going through some hard time, etc. My plan for that day is to show you some books I acquired recently, including the books I bought myself during the NYRB sale recently, an unplanned shopping extravaganza for me that Ridbook tricked me into. If you don't know Ridbook, go check out her excellent channel, which I will link to in the description box. In addition to that little book haul, I'll try perhaps to share a couple of my family's winter holiday traditions. Finally, during the last week of December, I think I'll finish up the year by going back to E.B. White, this time to his larger collection of essays about all sorts of topics. I'm doing this for 2 reasons. One, of course, because I enjoyed the democracy essays so much that I'd like to read more of his essays about other topics. And secondly, because in the comments to that video, the wonderful David Novak suggested that we should all have a, quote, white Christmas, an E.B. White Christmas. It will still be part of the 12 days of Christmas, right? Please feel free to join me if you like. My slippers, a warm robe, and a cup of hot cocoa will be at the ready. Well, thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon, very soon, probably late afternoon tomorrow, right before I light the candle for the first night of Hanukkah.